Welcome back to another episode of Practice Underwater. This is Suzanne, and I have a special guest with me today. I have someone who I consider a very dear friend. I want to welcome Clint Johnson. He's the owner and CEO of Profitable PPOs. I want to welcome you to the show, Clint.
Thanks, Suzanne. It's good to be here. Good to chat with you.
I am so excited to have you with us today. I was thinking about this morning as I was thinking about our recording. Boy, you and I go way back, don't we?
It's years, at least a decade that we've been friends and worked with practices. So yes, it's been a friendship that I've very much appreciated.
Oh, same here. So this has been long overdue. I've wanted you on the show for a long time. I'm really excited that our listeners have you as a resource today. Um, internally, the coaching department, I have to share this with you. The internal coaching department calls you the insurance guru. I know there are many others out there who call you the insurance guru. That's quite the title.
I can live with that. That is the particular niche that we've chosen professionally is to work with dental insurance. So if we can be considered gurus within that space, I'm quite content with that.
So you have a journey in dentistry that I feel is really interesting. It's in your blood. I'd love for you to share your journey in dentistry with the audience.
Oh, sure. I love dentistry. I was fortunate to grow up as somebody surrounded by it. I was actually born when my father was in dental school, and after my father got out of dental school, he practiced with my grandfather. So I was surrounded by a father who was a dentist. My grandfather, who lived just a half a block away, was a dentist, and then my great grandfather was also a dentist. And then within their dental practice, I had my two uncles who were dental lab techs. So from the 1940s up until my father retired in about 2010, there was 70 years of contiguous dentists in my family. So we talked a lot of dentistry. When I was young, it was sort of expected that I would go into dentistry. So as a young man, maybe in my early teens, I started going to dental continuing education workshops with my dad. Even though I didn't understand a lot of it, I'd be 12, 13 years old and sitting in there in a course surrounded by a bunch of dentists. So I grew up around dentistry. I loved it. Once I got into college, decided that the clinical side was not really for me. So at the age of 22, which was 25 years ago, I actually started on the consulting side, and I've never left. And it's a fabulous group of people to be involved with, and the profession has changed, but I still love dentistry. And now I'm dealing with dentists all day. I married a hygienist. I have 6 or 7 other family members who are still in dentistry. So it's sort of like our family business, so to speak.
Oh, that's awesome. That was destiny, I guess, right?
Indeed.
So what made you decide to start Profitable PPOs?
Back around 2011, I was doing some consulting work with various practices and kept having doctors who were really struggling with the PPO side of it and were locked into PPOs who were unprofitable. The doctors were confused. They couldn't figure out how they got into all these plans when they thought they may have signed up for just 2 or 3. And so it really caused me to reflect on these problems that our clients were having. And we started finding some solutions and uh, developing some ways to improve the fees. And really, an opportunity just arose to focus strictly on the PPO aspect. And so since 2012, we've done nothing other than the PPO improvement, optimization, uh, reduction of plans when appropriate for doctors. But it was really born out of seeing our clients who were struggling badly and frustrated and hated their life with the PPOs that the opportunity came, and it was a way for me to really contribute. There was there was just this frustration and hatred and confusion that so many doctors had for the insurance PPOs. And I thought, you know what? That's an opportunity for me to really help doctors at a new level. And uh, I, I've been thrilled. We've been able to help reduce PPO adjustments by millions of dollars on a monthly basis. At this point, we help doctors save millions and millions of dollars, and it's been very, very rewarding to be able to do so.
That's awesome. Do you remember calling me, telling me that we had a doctor who wanted to hug you and kiss you? So I, uh,
Indeed.
I, I don't doubt that that happens on a daily basis because you're right. That is such an area of just confusion, and there's definitely a need to have some hand holding. So I love that you're offering that service where you can, hand hold the doctors throughout the entire process. And I know you guys are growing. You keep adding team members. It sounds like all the time.
We do, and there's an ever evolving situation in dentistry with the PPOs. There's more PPOs than there's ever been, and frankly, PPOs are much more difficult than they were 10 years ago, and certainly infinitely more complex than they were 15 years ago. So that requires continual support and continual education on our end, but there's not a shortage of doctors who need help. And so in response to that, we need to keep adding team, training them in the particular areas that we're able to assist with. And so yeah, we've been fortunate to grow over the years, and we're fortunate to be able to work with hundreds of practices across the country, and it's fun. It's fun to see the different things that they're experiencing and the different successes that can occur in different parts of the country.
So, tell me exactly, or tell our audience exactly what Profitable PPOs does. Like, what is your day in and day out?
Oh yeah. So on a day in and day out basis, what we're doing is analyzing the situations for doctors who are participating with PPOs already, and looking at those situations through 6 or 7 different lenses, meaning 6 or 7 different ways to improve PPOs. And we're saying which of these methods would most help this doctor improve their PPO fees and thus their profitability. We're also working with a lot of doctors who are buying practices or starting practices to say, how could we configure the insurance participation for this startup or this buyer so that they get paid the very most for the dentistry that they're going to be doing when their practice opens or when they've purchased this practice. Then we're handling all the paperwork for them with the credentialing. We're crunching numbers in all sorts of different interesting ways, because with insurance, there's a lot of different ways that you can participate as a doctor, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, at some point today. But it's very common for fees with one insurance plan to vary 25 to 40%. And so our job is to look at all of those different ways for a doctor to participate and figure out which one will make them the most money or cause them to have the smallest amount of PPO write-offs, and then to configure that on their behalf.
So, your customer is the pre-owner as well as the owner, right?
Indeed, we get to work with a lot of doctors who've bought practices years ago and signed up for a lot of PPOs. And at this point, they're fed up with them. They don't know if there's options for improvement. So they come to us to help them, as well as doctors who are 20 years into their professional career and have a well-established practice. For those doctors, we're able to do a deep dive assessment of what their insurance participation looks like, how much volume they're doing with a particular plan, and what strategies could be applied there to improve their PPO reimbursement. So yeah, we see the full gamut from startup to nearing retirement.
Here's a question I get all the time, Clint. I know I need to credential. Probably I need to negotiate. Like, am I doing both? Is there an advantage to doing one over the other? Do we do both? Help
Yeah,
us understand that.
absolutely. Well, for a lot of new doctors, there is a bit of confusion surrounding the issue of being a PPO provider. I think first and foremost, it's important to understand that if you're not a PPO provider with an insurance company, with a PPO, then in almost all situations, you'll still be paid by the insurance company. That's what out-of-network benefits are for. We'll often have young doctors who are in a panic saying, I've got to get credentialed as quickly as possible so that I can get paid. And we have to say, whoa, let's stop for a second and understand. As an out-of-network provider, if you're not a credentialed provider with that insurance company, you're still going to get paid. You're going to utilize the patient's out-of-network benefits. And so you will have money coming in. Now, the difference between simply an out-of-network provider and a credentialed provider is, as a credentialed in-network PPO provider, what you are effectively doing is saying, I am agreeing to reduce my PPO fees for a certain percentage, let's say 25, 30, 40% overall, in exchange for showing up on the insurance company list and patients seeing me as a preferred provider. Preferred provider essentially just means you've agreed to discount your fees in order to be more accessible to that patient. Now, a doctor who wants to negotiate, what they're looking at is the intersection of two things. They're looking not just at participation, but they're looking also at profit. Okay, so a credential, some doctors want to just credential, and what they're saying to us, if they just say, I want to credential, is I want to get it done as fast as possible, regardless of what the profitability is. Negotiation followed by credentialing is the intersection of that participation and profit, where we're looking to say, we're going to get you into network, but let's figure out the most profitable way to get you into network. Let's set you up with the best fees so that over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years of your career, you're making more money. So what we tell doctors is it's not always possible. Indeed, it's rarely possible to get great fees and to do it really, really quickly with the insurance companies. If you want better fees that are going to be more profitable for years or decades, then it takes some time to work through the different scenarios, because there's different ways to contract that need to be considered. There's lots of different relationships between insurance companies that need to be explored in order to identify the singular most profitable option for a doctor.
And there are different strategies that apply from state to state, right? Like one insurance company in California may be totally different than that same one somewhere in the Midwest, right?
Oh, no doubt. There are massive differences from state to state. If somebody is telling a doctor, oh, here's what you need to do because in California, this is how it is, and that doctor's in Texas, it's just not even remotely the same. So there will absolutely be strategies that are different depending upon what state that you're in. And I'll just use an example of Blue Cross. In California, the way Blue Cross operates is very different than the way it does in Texas. And that's very different than the way it is in Illinois. In Illinois or Texas, you may have 6 to 7 different ways to participate with Blue Cross, with fees on crowns ranging from as low as, let's say, $590 to as high as $1,200. There is literally $600 difference in, let's say, Texas or Illinois or New Mexico or many other states between the worst way to contract with Blue and the best way. Conversely, in California, they have relationships with a few different companies, Blue Cross does. And so there you're exploring totally different relationships, but ultimately those put you into network with Blue Cross. And the fees in California can vary quite widely as well. But the configuration in California or Arizona would be different than Oklahoma, New Mexico, Illinois, Texas, North Carolina, something like that. So yeah, there is no one size fits all solution. Where a doctor might be starting or buying a practice, that state and the nuances there need to be considered when signing up with insurance PPOs if you're going to maximize your dollars. And for us as a company, that's really what we try and help doctors understand is you're going to be picking up that handpiece for a lot of years. And let's not rush into getting you signed up at the expense of you having lower fees for many years. You're going to be a network. You can breathe easy. You're going to get paid as an out-of-network provider while we're going through this process of setting you up in the most profitable way. But I promise you, 6 months down the road, you're going to be thrilled that you took that extra couple of breaths and assessed all your options and made the right choices versus just jumping in and doing the fastest thing possible just because you want to save a little time.
Oh, I love that. And honestly, this is another one of the reasons why I feel like it's important that we have a resource in the industry to go to because of all these nuances and differences, and one size doesn't fit all. And you guys know all of the ins and outs of all the different states. So I think another reason why it's important to reach out. So as we work with pre-owners, and I do due diligence with that group, I get the question about the infamous Delta Dental Premier, right? That's kind of one of those things high on the priority. And again, one of those things that is different from state to state. So let's talk about that a little bit. When the seller is Premier and there is a buyer, what's the potential impact of that on the buyer that would be interested in that practice?
Oh, it can absolutely be massive. And this is why it's so important that a doctor do a proper analysis and have somebody like you doing the due diligence, because the impact can be huge. So in the United States today, Delta is different from state to state, right? And that's important for a pre-owner to understand that if we're talking about Arizona, Delta of Arizona is different than, let's say, Delta of New Mexico or Texas, right? So there is no one size fits all solution. If a doctor is considering buying a practice that is Delta Premier, then they really need to find out if they're going to have the ability to join at that same Premier level. In some states, yes, you can still join at the Premier level. In some states, you cannot join at the Premier level. And if that's the case, then a doctor buying that practice needs to understand what are the fees that the seller had, what are the fees that I as a buyer would have, and how many procedures are being done on Delta. So essentially you want to figure out what's the variance going to be in fees. Is the crown going to go from $900 to say $700? There's $200 variance there. And how many crowns did the doctor do over this past year? So you can kind of quantify that. Now, in some states, Delta is even more complicated or restrictive, where they will not let a doctor be at the Premier level if that doctor is going to participate with any other insurance plans. So as an example, Arizona, where you and I both happen to live. In Arizona, a doctor cannot be a Premier provider if they're going to if they're going to be in network with, let's say, Cigna or MetLife or Aetna. That literally disqualifies them from being a Premier provider within this state. Something else that it's important for doctors to know if they're considering buying a Premier practice is that it can also vary from city to city. In certain parts of Arizona, again, just because it's in our backyard, it is possible for a doctor to be a Premier provider so long as they don't take any other insurances. Other parts within the state, they're not able to be a Premier provider at all. If you go to Illinois, there are certain parts of Chicago, let's say, where a doctor could be Premier, and there are certain parts of Chicago where Delta just says we have enough providers at this point that we will not take on any additional providers. So it's very important to not rely on what you've heard from a buddy, not rely certainly on what the seller has heard through the grapevine, but instead as a buyer to reach out to Delta and say, I am looking to buy a practice in this zip code. Will I be able to be a premier provider or not? In addition, if that seller is going to work back for you after you've bought the practice, you need to find out if the seller will be able to retain the premier status that he or she may have had. In many cases, they're not. So we just recently had a situation where a doctor came to us. He had bought a practice, hadn't worked with you, hadn't worked with us. He bought the practice a couple months ago, had retained the seller. And they had a really upset doctor because this doctor who had been the seller had committed to work back for 2 years, not realizing, neither one of them realized that seller, once the practice was sold, would not be able to retain his premier status. So now the seller, now working as an associate, is working for about 35% less fees. He had run all of his financial projections under the assumption that he was going to be able to keep his premier fees. Never crossed his mind, and the practice is dramatically less profitable for both doctors now because of the lack of premier participation there. So Delta is one. There is not a cut and dry scenario. What I would tell every doctor is find out if the seller is premier or PPO, reach out to Delta, find out if you as a buyer can be premier in that particular location, see if you can get it in writing. If there's any chance that the seller is going to work back for you, see if that seller is going to be saddled with the PPO fees as well. Delta can really, really change dramatically, and we've seen situations where it affects the cash flow of the practice by hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, dropping from premier to PPO. And generally speaking, Delta is moving more and more to this restrictive model where they are not letting doctors be premier. So there's a good chance that for many of the listeners today, many of them will not be able to be at the premier level.
Oh, that makes sense. So let's kind of give our listeners just a couple of things to look out for, like pre-owners, like a couple of bullet points that they should be looking out for or asking or researching before they decide to purchase that practice. Just again, as part of our due diligence.
Sure. So it's important, I believe, for doctors to understand that there's a lot of linked PPOs. And what that means is that insurance companies do not want to pay you out of network fees. That is the most profitable thing for the doctor. It's the least profitable thing for the insurance company. So what they have done is they have tied one insurance company to another. So if you join company A, it's going to be linked to company B, C, D, and sometimes E, F, G, H, I, J, K. So if you are looking to buy a practice and the seller says to you, oh, I only have Delta and United Concordia, that's not necessarily going to be true. The example there would be, okay, the seller has Delta, but United Concordia is also bundled with Emeritus, Principal, Assurant, DHA, Blue Cross, and 4 or 5 others, right? So if a doctor is telling you, I only have a couple of PPO plans, I would be quite cautious about that, because what you can largely assume is for each plan that they tell you that they have in the practice, it's most likely linked to 3 or 4 others. So I would do some due diligence on that particular thing. Look to see if the seller's name is showing up on the insurance directories of a lot of lists. So it's very easy to go to Aetna and do search for a provider and see if the seller's listed there, and do the same thing for Cigna. Within 20 minutes, you could check Aetna, Cigna, MetLife, United Healthcare, Humana, and see if the doctor's in quite a few networks. So I would absolutely do that. In addition, if you're buying a practice or considering buying a practice, it would be something that we would highly suggest asking was around the utilization of any umbrellas. So in dentistry, there are these umbrella plans, so to speak, or what are largely considered recruiter companies. They go by the name of, let's say, Dentamax or Diversify Dental or Connection Dental or Maverist or Carrington or Premier. If a seller tells you they have one of those or several of those, then what they are really conveying to you, whether they realize it or not, is that they have agreed to take anywhere from 20 to 200 other PPOs. Let's say the seller says, oh, I have only a couple plans. I have Dentamax and I have Delta. What they're really conveying to you is they have Delta, and then there's something to the effect of nearly 200 different PPOs under that Dentamax umbrella. So don't trust necessarily, and I don't suggest that brokers or dentists that are selling practices are intentionally trying to mislead you. What I'm instead suggesting is this is so complex that many times they don't understand. So if you, again, hear Dentamax, Diversified, Connection, Maverist, Carrington, Premier, if you hear those, understand that that is going to be a practice that has at least 20 different PPO plans underneath it. I would suggest if you were looking to buy a practice and you're going to need to get credentialed with insurance companies, to make sure that your malpractice, your DEA, your license all have at least a year before they expire. Okay. What will sometimes happen is when it goes to the point with the credentialing company of processing your application, if your malpractice is going to be expiring in a couple months, they will often reject that application and come back to you and say, need to start again when you have updated malpractice. Okay. And those delays can be really frustrating. Credentialing times can vary a lot. So I would make sure that when it comes to the time to credential, to make sure you have all of those things with at least a year in them. Having a type 2 NPI is something that we would suggest for a lot of doctors. And we can get into the nuance there. Certainly as a buyer, I would also suggest that either somebody do due diligence for them, or they do some, if they're doing it on their own, they need to be looking at EOBs. Ask for a sampling of EOBs and look at those, and you'll be able to get a very good feel for what are the PPO adjustments that are being done, who is the doctor in network with. So those would be a few things. And then certainly make sure you have a tax ID number. This, much too often, doctors think they're going to utilize the seller's tax ID number. And that is, as you and I have talked about numerous times, that is something we would certainly try to steer them away from. The utilization of the seller's tax ID number and name after a practice purchase is, for a lot of different reasons, not a strategy we would endorse.
Okay. Clint, let's talk about that a little bit more. Can we go deeper on that? Because I love where this is headed here. This is kind of one of those things that is perhaps a misconception in the industry, and maybe a buddy or the broker or somebody else is kind of leading the way in that discussion of, oh, you can use the seller's tax ID, and you have seen, some not so great things come out of that. So let's kind of go down that road a little bit.
Sure. So I think fundamentally it's important for a doctor to understand the basics of an insurance claim when they file it. When they file that claim, there are some boxes there for information on who's the rendering provider, meaning who picked up the handpiece and actually did the treatment. And then there's another section for who does that provider work for. So when you submit that claim, you are certifying that the information on that is true and accurate. So if you're going to put inaccurate information on that, if you're going to list the seller as being the doctor who rendered the treatment, you're creating an incorrect, fraudulent claim. All right. And the challenges that come from that are significant. One of them is that by submitting a incorrect, fraudulent claim, you open yourself up to situations where, if detected, that will often have to be reported. So federal law, now this, I'm not an attorney, but our attorney and I have talked on this extensively. So federal law requires the dental boards report to the National Practitioner Data Bank if there's a billing irregularity. Okay, so what that means is if you get caught using somebody else's tax ID or putting somebody else's name on the claim and that gets reported, all of the insurance companies who utilize the National Practitioner Data Bank can see that. And from there, they can investigate you and kick you out of the PPO networks. There are cases where doctors have had to declare bankruptcy because they got caught doing this and then they were booted out of all of the PPO networks due to billing irregularities and misrepresentation / fraud. So that would be one issue. I can give you a couple of horror stories just in the last month and a half that have come to our attention, new clients who've come to us to make sure, making sure I'm saying that these are people who come to us because they have problems. But we recently had a doctor just 2 weeks ago who came to us. He had not credentialed his associates and was billing the associates out under his name with Delta. He got caught and he had to pay a fairly significant penalty for having falsified those claims, putting his own name on the claims. And so the reverse is true as well, that if you were putting the seller's name on it and you get caught, then there's some challenges there, some potential penalties. Another is recently, about a month ago, we had a doctor come to us and say, I bought the practice a year ago from a family member. And in order to avoid all the headaches with credentialing, I just used his tax ID number for a while. Well, the IRS detected that because the seller had retired, but his tax ID was still being used. He got hit with a multi-$100,000 notice from the IRS. So now the seller who had sold the practice, been done, gets hit with a nasty notice from the IRS for hundreds of thousands of dollars of back taxes because his tax ID number was still being utilized. Another reason why you shouldn't utilize the seller's tax identification number is that in credentialing, some insurance companies are going to ask for a bill of sale. So when it ultimately gets to the point that they're reviewing your application and they look at the bill of sale and they see that you bought the practice months ago, but in the meantime, that seller's tax ID has still continued to be used, it raises a red flag. They look at that and they say, wait a minute, if the practice was sold 2 months ago, we're now getting around to processing the application. Why have we continued to get claims from this practice that was sold? And so then they turn around, they investigate you, they find out that you've been using the seller's tax ID, and you're starting off your career just a couple months into it under investigation for using somebody else's tax identification. There's so many headaches, Suzanne, that come from using the seller's tax ID. There's a lot of reasons it could help, of course, because it would be nice if you don't get caught. It would be nice to have that in-network status until the new owner is credentialed, but it's not legal. And it's certainly, in our opinion, not worth taking the risk as a new doctor, as a new owner to do that. We would highly discourage somebody from using the seller's tax ID number There are certain situations where that can be put into the contract, and that's beyond our scope of expertise. But attorneys do tell me there are situations where legally, depending upon the type of entity and whether it's a stock sale or an asset sale, those type of things, there are some situations where the seller's tax ID can be purchased, I believe, or utilized. But unless that's explicitly written into your agreement, then we would highly discourage you from, not you specifically, Suzanne, but highly discourage any doctor from utilizing the seller's information inappropriately, because you risk a very significant situation where both of you can get in trouble.
Those are great, great tips. And I think good things for everyone to look out for when they're purchasing a practice. And I think the moral of that story is due diligence is important. Part of that is also being coached on how to deal with this, what questions to ask, what to dig into. Yeah. And then you alluded earlier to this. I get asked this question a lot. I know you get asked this question a lot in terms of like NPIs type 1 and 2. You kind of briefly touched on that. I think that's another good point as well. We get so many questions on that. What's your recommendation there, Clint?
Sure. So most every doctor is going to have a type 1 NPI. A type 1 NPI is basically your national provider identification number, and almost every doctor will have that. Rare exceptions might exist for a doctor who had gone to dental school, let's say someplace out of the United States, but almost every listener is going to have a type 1 NPI number, and that number is going to be listed on the claims for the treatment you do. Now, type 2 NPI is essentially what's considered a group NPI, is the original terminology. But what that is an identification number for the billing entity, very much like a tax ID number. But according to the American Dental Association, a type 2 NPI number should be used on any claims if it's a multi-doctor practice or if it's a solo doctor practice operating as a corporation. All right. So for us, as we look at practices across the country, the vast majority of those practices, even if it's only one doctor, are operating as a corporation. As such, they should have a type 2 NPI number. And that type 2 NPI number then would be listed on their claims. There would type 1 would be put on the section of the claim where it says who's the doctor who did the treatment. The type 2 would be put on the section of the claim that says who's the billing entity. All right. So even if you're a one doctor, even if you're a doctor buying a practice next month and the seller's going to retire and you're going to be the only provider there, if you're a corporation, then you should get a type 2 NPI and put that on your claim. Luckily, it's a very easy process. The getting a type 2 NPI, you get it through the same rendering entity as a type 1 NPI. You literally go in, you log in with your information that you use for your type 1, and you'll have the opportunity to set up a type 2 NPI. It's typically going to take maybe 30 minutes or so online to get that applied for. And sometimes you can have it by the next day. In some cases, you can have it the same day. It doesn't really take time of any significant magnitude to get that. There's no cost to do it. But it's also important not just to be in compliance on the claim, but also understand there are some companies, and we'll use Delta as an example. There are situations where Delta will deny a claim if it's a corporation, as most doctors are, submitting that claim and there's not a type 2 NPI on it. So if you're going to buy a practice and you're going to sign up for Delta or XYZ other insurance company, you want to put that type 2 NPI in your initial application, right? That way it gets processed. The flip side to that is not having it, submitting claims, the claims come back denied because you don't have a type 2 NPI, and then you have to go through the process of then informing Delta you have a type 2, waiting weeks as they update their systems, so on and so forth. So it's just it's the legal way to do it. It's the right way to do it. It will make things easier. There's just not any reason not to have a type 2 NPI at this point. 5 years ago, it was less of an issue. There will be lots of sellers out there who don't have a type 2 NPI. And basically, they just haven't been operating in full compliance with the guidelines from the American Dental Association there and what's put on the claim. But we would suggest any new doctor, let's set it up right. Let's have a type 2 NPI for you if you're a corporation, and start right from day one so that you can eliminate any potential headaches and issues down the road. And again, it's a very, very easy thing to get a type 2 NPI. There's just not a reason not to do it.
So again, you're saying do that. Your recommendation is do that early on, right from the get-go, so that you have everything ready to go as you move forward, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, at the point where you're setting up your entity, whether you're setting up your own corporation or whether you're having your CPA or an attorney, set up that corporation and get your tax ID number. As soon as you have that, and then request a type 2 NPI at that point. It's just going forward, it's going to be more and more common to have insurance claims deny because they don't have that type 2 NPI. And let's just set it up as close to perfectly and as close to being in compliance with all the guidelines, so for the rest of your career, you don't need to worry about it.
Yep, that makes sense. Now, we talked about the pre-owners. What about those listeners that are, let's say, solo doctors now and want to grow their practices toward a group practice? Is now the time to get them to sign up for the NPI too?
Yeah, if they're a corporation, they should do it now. There's no reason not to.
Yep.
If they're, let's say, operating as an LLC right now, then my understanding is that a one doctor LLC or a one doctor sole proprietor does not need that type 2 entity. But when you bring in a second doctor, it's highly unlikely that you would remain a sole proprietor at that point or an LLC, and will most likely transition to a corporation. And so, yes, even as a one doctor corporation now, if you don't have a type 2, it's a good thing to use. Once you have it, you can start putting it on the claim form, and instead of putting your own individual NPI, start putting your corporation NPI on there, meaning the type 2. It's just it gives you better protection. It's more accurate. It's better compliance. There's just not really a good reason to avoid doing it.
You bet. You bet. So here's a scenario that I kind of want you to share with our listeners. So you work with doctors who come to you obviously from other sources, and you have doctors that come to you from us that have worked with us to do due diligence. What, in your opinion, have you seen as differences there? And share with our listeners what you think the benefits are of having this due diligence done, and then they're coming to you.
Oh yeah, it's so important. We're not doing video here, but if the audience could see me, I'm sort of hitting my head here because some of the things that happen to doctors buying the practices because of lack of due diligence or proper due diligence are really sad. I mean, I'm passionate about dentistry. I love the profession, but some of the headaches that these doctors have to deal with because they step into a practice without a proper understanding of what was happening, or because accurate information was not conveyed to them by the seller, whether that's negligence, whether it's just misunderstanding, whatever it would be. It just makes me so so sad. It's such a difficult thing for a young doctor to start off in a practice where they don't thoroughly understand what they're getting into. So for us, we don't do due diligence. That's not our area of specialty. That's yours. And having that professional look at this potential investment, you're going to be paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy this practice. Maybe it's 200, maybe it's 500, maybe it's 700, maybe it's $1 million you're going to be paying for this practice. Have some professionals, some people who have experience, look at that and identify where there's gaps, or identify where there's questions, identify where there's opportunities for you to step in as a new owner and grow that thing. It's just so key. But we find a lot of situations where doctors have not had proper due diligence done, and they just struggle. They don't understand why the numbers are different than what they may have thought they were going to be. And it starts from not having accurate information. So that's why I love what you do on the due diligence side, is you can really help these doctors to get a good understanding of what the true economics of the practice are, what the potential pitfalls are in a practice, and what the untapped opportunities are. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the vast majority of these headaches come because of unethical sellers or unethical brokers or something like that. What I'm instead suggesting is that dentistry and overhead and patient care and recall rates and PPO fees and insurance utilization, those are all really complex topics. And for a seller, they're not typically focused on those things. They're typically focused on patient care, your healthcare providers. So it's not uncommon for a doctor to not understand all the nuances within their practice. So if I were buying a practice today, if I were a dentist buying a practice, and this is 25 years of dental experience speaking here, no chance in this wide world that I would buy a practice without having some professionals look at it. I've got 25 years of experience, and I know a fair amount about dentistry, not being arrogant, but after 25 years, you should. Even with what I know right now, I would not buy a practice without having somebody else, also a professional, give me a second opinion on it, a professional opinion, somebody who's looked at other practices. So I think it's key. I can't imagine spending that kind of money on a practice and not having a report and as a professional having given me some guidance there. Sorry, I get wound up about this and sort of evangelical, right? Because I just see so many doctors make mistakes that it makes me sick when they could have been easily prevented by doing proper due diligence.
Great points you're bringing up, Clint. I'm totally getting fired up here as well. So listen, we've talked about pre-owners up until now, and so we have listeners in our audience also that own a practice currently. Maybe they've owned for a couple of years. So talk to us about what you do with insurance, and obviously that's not the credentialing side unless changes have to be made, but that's renegotiating often. So how do our owner doctors benefit from your services as well? And what's the time frame there, if like they have to wait any time before they start working with you after purchasing a practice?
Sure. So we find a lot of doctors will come to us after having owned the practice for a couple of years, and they say, "Boy, I'm working really hard here, and we're not making nearly as much money as I hoped to make, or our PPO adjustments are killing us." And so what we can do is an in-depth analysis of what's happening with those insurance PPOs and really hone in on how much volume are they doing with each plan and how good or how bad are the fees. And we can identify for them where there's opportunities for improvement. Now, most doctors have heard this term of renegotiating a contract. And that's essentially the process of going to the insurance company and saying, we're unhappy with these fees. They haven't been adjusted in years. Can we enter into a new contract that compensates the doctor at a better level? And that's something that every doctor should do at least every 24 to 36 months. Now, the bigger opportunity than renegotiation for most doctors is what we would call optimization or reconfiguration. And that's really driven by the understanding that lots of insurance companies share networks. Okay. So this will get a bit deep here, but it's very, very important for doctors to understand. If you wanted to participate with, let's just say Aetna as an example, just because alphabetically it's right at the top of the list. And I'm not picking on Aetna here, but a doctor can join Aetna by signing a contract with Aetna. But if a doctor doesn't have a contract with Aetna, they can also be put in the Aetna network through Connection Dental or through Guardian or through a lot of other different relationships. Aetna has a relationship with Emeritus and Principal and Connection and Carrington and Zealous and so on and so forth. So fundamentally, what a doctor would need to understand is that for Aetna, there are 6 or 7 different possible fee schedules that can be used. Then you look at Emeritus, and there are 6 or 7 different possible fee schedules that can be used with Emeritus. Then you do the same thing with Assurant. You do the same thing with Cigna. And so each one of these plans has 6 or 7 different possible relationships, meaning links to other insurance companies. So what we do is we assess for a doctor, who are you in network with now? And is that the best configuration, meaning the most profitable configuration for you? Or would you be better off staying in that PPO network and using somebody else's fee schedule who will offer you better fees? Okay, and if so, we can analyze the variance there, and we can say, if you were to participate with, again, let's just say Aetna, if you were to participate with Aetna under this fee schedule, here's how much additional profit you would be able to make. And if you participated with Aetna under this fee schedule, here's the variance in profit. So the game is not just to rely on renegotiation. That's just one strategy of numerous strategies. Really, there's 7 different ways to improve PPO fees. So what we do is we look at all of those strategies and figure out which one will make the doctor the most profit. I would essentially relate it to dentistry, where if a doctor looks at a decayed tooth, they're not just going to say, we need to do an amalgam on it. You don't just rely on a single technique, just like you don't rely on only renegotiation. A doctor will look at that and they'll say, well, we could do an amalgam, we could do a composite, we may need to crown it, we could do an onlay, we could do a CERAC, we could do zirconia, we could do EMAX. Maybe we have to just extract it, we have to put an implant in there. There's different ways to address different situations. So our job is to look at a doctor's situation and say, not only can it be better, but of the available ways for it to be better, which one is the most profitable? And then we structure that so that going forward, the doctor is more profitable and yet can still be in network for the patients that they were a PPO provider with. And it's a complex process. Insurance companies have created this game. Insurance companies don't want doctors to easily understand all the linked networks and all the nuances there. And they don't ask any front desk person who's been in dentistry, as you know, Suzanne, and certainly as we encounter, anybody who's been in dentistry for 10 years or so knows that insurance is much more complex now than it's ever been. So
you bet.
our job is to understand that nuance for a doctor and help them to participate more profitably. And it's awesome. We had somebody yesterday, doctor from Chicago, and we just finished her project. And I'm super excited for her. With the work that we did, it's going to add $477,000 of increased profit over the next 2 years, because she came to us as an absolute mess, had her PPOs configured completely the wrong ways. So it took us a year to fix it. Nothing with insurance. Fixing insurance is never fast. but it took us a year to fix it. But based upon her current volume, that will result in $477,000 over the next 2 years. Now, over the next 10 years, you start getting into insane numbers. And over 20 years, of course, they'll just be millions and millions and millions of dollars there. But we look at it on a 2-year basis, because 2 years from now, we're going to go in and we're going to tweak it even more to make more money going forward. But if somebody has EagleSoft or Open Dental or Dentrix, we can quantify that possible improvement for them. And on our end, we guarantee them a positive return on investment. We do an analysis for a doctor, and we tell them, hey, when we do this analysis, there looks like there's opportunity here, and they have to invest in our services, but we guarantee them a positive return on investment. And it's so fun. I mean, it's so fun to help these doctors so that when they go into their practice, they're not as frustrated with the insurance situation. They feel better walking into that operatory and seeing the patient. I mean, when we used to call them heart sink patients, meaning if you look at your schedule and your heart sinks because you see somebody with a particular insurance plan and you know you're not going to get paid a decent fee, that's really not cool at all. And it makes you, in some ways, you can start to resent that patient because you're working so hard on them, given such great care, and then you're not getting paid anything. So that's one of the things I love about our opportunity to serve dentists, is helping them feel better about the patients that they're going to see, and of course helping them be compensated at a level that's commensurate with the education and the investments in time and technology and education that they put into it.
That's amazing. So this part of the conversation is all about, just because you are sitting at a specific place with insurances right now, there's always an opportunity going forward to look at things a little differently, to analyze things, to see how you can optimize, how you can maximize those, right?
Oh, absolutely. Again, it's no different than dentistry. What is in somebody's mouth today is not going to be the exact same as 2 years or 3 years from now. Things change in our mouths, things change in insurance. And so if a doctor is just fed up with their insurance right now, or they're not even sure if they're in the best situation right now, then it makes sense to do an examination. That's what a patient who hasn't seen a dentist for 3 years, they need to get their butt in the chair and get an exam. Well, the same thing here. If a doctor hasn't looked at their insurance situation ever or within the last few years, it makes sense to see if there is some possibility of better fees, more profitability. In a lot of cases, there are, because it just changes. It changes in our mouths. It changes with insurance. It's just an ever-evolving thing.
So what do our doctors need to have prepared, Clint, when they're going to speak with you or with a member of your team?
Yeah, if we're going to have a consult with a doctor, we're happy to have a no charge conversation with them, and they can reach out to us, and we'll send them a simple little info form, or they can even get it on their online at our website at profitableppos.com. But we would ask them just to provide us a bit of information that shows, here's a sampling of fees. So give us your PPO fee for a pro fee, a 3-surface composite, and a crown. That's assuming you're a GP. Obviously, if you're a periodontist or endodontist, you do other codes. But we ask for them to provide us just the PPO fee on 3 codes. And so it's going to take somebody at the office 10 minutes to fill out this little bit of information to send to us. From that, we can just jump on the phone and have a quick conversation. Say, hey, based upon what you sent to us, it looks like there would typically be some opportunities available here. And occasionally there's not. And then at least you know. But if we see that based upon that one little sampling of info that there would potentially be some opportunity, then we can go into an actual deep dive analysis where we look at EOBs, and there's a fee associated with that. It's around the cost of a crown, but for about the cost of a crown, we look at EOBs, we do a fee analysis, we look at how a doctor's participating, we look to see if there's other ways to participate more profitably. It takes us about 3 weeks to do that, but yeah, it's around the cost of a crown, and we can really give the doctor some in-depth knowledge there. They get about a 40-page report uh, with all of that. But I would discourage anybody from the idea of thinking that they are stuck with their situation forever, and encourage them to think that options and opportunities often exist with PPOs, whether that's renegotiating, whether that's reconfiguring it to move to somebody else, or an opportunity that we haven't even mentioned, Suzanne, but a tip as well for if you're thinking of buying a practice would be to understand the concept of a tiered network. So many doctors, you and I talked a few minutes ago on Delta, and that's an example of a tiered network, meaning a high tier, the premier, and a lower tier, the PPO. Well, I should have mentioned this in the tips, but if you're buying a practice or you already have a practice, be aware of those opportunities. If a seller says to you, "Oh, I'm in Cigna," Cigna has multiple levels. MetLife has multiple levels. Delta has multiple levels. Blue Cross has multiple levels, right? And so we have seen doctors who don't use professional help go in and they sign up for the lowest level, not realizing that the seller was on the higher level. And when you sign up at the low level, what you are agreeing to do is treat all patients with that particular plan at the low level. So if the doctor was at the high level, you sign up. I'm sorry, if the seller was at the high level, you sign up for the low level, the fees are going to plummet. Now, the reverse is true as well. Many times sellers will be at the low level, and after some examination, we can determine that 85 or 90% of the patients have the high level plan. So we will pose that question to a buyer many times is, would you be comfortable, let's say using Cigna as an example, would you be comfortable being a network for 10% less Cigna patients if the other 90% of the Cigna patients had 25% higher fees? Very rarely will a doctor say no to that because it's simple math. Yes, give me 10% less PPO participation if I make much better fees on 90%. So that's a tip. Don't simply accept that the doctor says, "Oh, I'm in Cigna or I'm in Met or I'm in Blue," without figuring out which level of participation that is. And for an existing practice, when we're doing an analysis, that's often something we're going to discuss with them is, "Hey, you're on the low level plan. Are we sure that that's the right level for you?" Because fundamentally, a lot of these plans, whether it's Cigna, whether it's Met, whether it's Delta, whether it's Blue, with a lot of these plans, a significant number of the patients actually have the higher benefit package and have better fees.
So that goes back to our earlier point and the point you drove home about the due diligence, right? The synergy that, our two companies basically have is that we're really able to, at the forefront, have all of most anyway, of the questions answered. And I know you and I have often kind of talked about, okay, during due diligence, part of that, when I do that, is pulling the fee schedules to allow you guys the opportunity, if we have the software allows us to do that, we can have the fee schedules pulled ahead of time so you can do the research and have a lot of those questions answered before we get into the final purchase, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very beneficial for a doctor to have that information at their disposal so that they can make informed decisions. Knowledge is power if it's applied correctly.
Awesome. So, Clint, you also offer a special to our shared practices clients. Tell us quickly about that.
Yeah, we do. We offer a discount of 10% for shared practices members, and that's for doctors who are buying a practice. If they're a shared practice member and they're starting a practice, that discount would apply to them, as well as those who are existing practice owners and they come to us, and if they're a shared practices client, then yes, they receive a 10% discount on our services there to help them optimize their PPO participation. And really, it's because of the synergies between what you guys do at shared practices, what we do, our shared values there, and it just makes sense working together as a team. We can impact much greater change collaboratively and jointly. So we're happy to do that because it allows us to work with doctors who we know and are confident in getting good guidance from you, right? And so to a large degree, a shared practices client for us is easier to work with because they have good information from you guys. They have a better understanding of the situation with the practice they're buying, let's say, or the practice that they're already in. So yeah, that's something we've done for the past year, and we're happy to continue doing because we very much like working with shared practices doctors and because of the respect that we have for what you do at shared practices.
Well, the feeling is definitely mutual. So
Thank you.
Clint, this has been an amazing time. You are such a wealth of information. I'm thinking that this will be something our listeners listen to over and over because I think they will be able to, they won't grasp everything at once, but going back to what did he say about that? So I know this will be something that is a great resource for everyone. And I always get such amazing feedback from anyone that you have worked with. That we have sent your way. So you and your team are amazing. How can our listeners reach out to you? If they want to talk to you guys or want to look at the optimization process or the credentialing process, how do they reach out to you guys directly?
Oh, sure. We're easy to find. They can reach out to us by phone. Our phone is 855 PPO GAIN, as in PPO GAIN. Or they can visit us online at profitableppos.com. And if they jump online, they can request information if they're a buyer or if they're starting a practice, if they have an existing practice. And then, yeah, a member of our team can chat with them and we can talk about their situation and if there's a way for us to add value and help them to participate more profitably. But yeah, we're happy to help doctors any way we can. And I just feel very fortunate to be in this position where we're able to help doctors deal with something that has so much potential to help them make more money and to also help them to practice more enjoyably. And I think it's on a daily basis, we deal with the challenges of insurance on the doctor's behalf a lot of time, but it's a very rewarding position for us to be able to help them make more money and to help them enjoy their practices more. So we're fortunate that way.
We are so grateful to have you as a resource here at Shared Practices. It was a pleasure having you on our show today, Clint. I hope you'll come back and visit again.
I would love to anytime. Thank you, Suzanne. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.